They came in their shining ships, their towering fleets blotting out the stars, their banners of dominion draped across the void like a declaration of inevitability. The Dominion Accord had subjugated hundreds of species without struggle. They were the architects of peace through dominance, the silent executioners of rebellion. War was an ancient relic to them, a primitive thing left behind in the ruins of lesser civilizations. They had forgotten what war truly was. Rael Voss stood aboard the bridge of his command ship, the Elthery blade, arms clasped behind his back as he regarded the world below with cold calculation. Draska 7, a strategic colony in the Dominion's expansion efforts. It had been slated for human settlement, a world rich in resources, perfect for integration. Instead, the humans had declared it theirs, defying the Dominion's offer of assimilation. That, Voss had been told, was their first mistake. The second was resisting. The fleet that had been sent to Sol had not returned. No distress signals. No final transmissions. Only silence. The Dominion believed the humans had struck first, launching a reckless attack that had somehow eradicated the occupying force. It was inconceivable. A species so young, barely a few centuries into space, could not have stood against one of the most advanced fleets in the galaxy. And yet, here Voss was, tasked with rectifying their defiance. He was not one for unnecessary bloodshed. War was not his preference, but the Dominion had given an ultimatum, submission or destruction. He had led conquests before. This would be no different. Commander, one of his officers spoke. Our drop forces report no response from the surface. No communications. No anti-air defenses. The planet is silent. A trap. It had to be. The humans were not fools. They had fought too fiercely at the outer colonies, too savagely for their lack of numbers. Something was wrong. Deploy recon squads, Voss ordered. I want full surface scans. No one moves until we know what we're walking into. Minutes passed, then an hour. The silence stretched. No reports. No disturbances. It was unnatural. Then, the first feed came through. A recon unit's body camera, shaky footage of abandoned human settlements, eerily still. Buildings intact. No signs of struggle. The squad advanced cautiously, their scanners sweeping for life signs, their weapons primed. Nothing. A city of ghosts. Then the feed cut out. One by one, the remaining squads lost contact. Static replaced their voices. The silence deepened. A cold unease settled over the bridge. Recall the teams, Voss commanded. Something's wrong. His comms officer scrambled to re-establish contact. Nothing. The Dominion forces were vanishing. No distress signals. No battles. Just erased. Then, at the edges of the system, they appeared. Human ships. Not the grand war fleets of the Dominion, not the polished, symmetrical designs of interstellar conquest. No, these were monstrous things. Hastily welded hulls, mismatched armor plating, burn scars from 100 battles. They looked like derelicts, ghosts of old wars, and yet they moved with purpose, deliberate and unwavering. Multiple contacts, the officer reported, his voice wavering. Numbers unknown. Unknown. Voss stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the display. Then he saw the movement. It wasn't just ships arriving. The darkness itself was shifting, morphing, expanding. Then, he understood. The humans had hidden in the wreckage of their own destroyed fleets, masking their approach in the debris of war. Their ships had already been here, waiting, camouflaged among the dead. A trap, not of desperation, not of reckless defiance. A calculated, patient, human trap. Shields up. Voss barked. Prepare for. A ripple of light streaked across the void. Then another. Then 1,000. Human weapons did not fire in controlled salvos. They did not engage in measured combat. They unleashed hell in torrents of unrelenting destruction. The first Dominion ships exploded instantly, their shields overwhelmed in a single moment of incomprehensible force. The Elthery blade rocked violently, alarms blaring, crew shouting as they scrambled to make sense of the onslaught. This was not war. This was an extermination. Voss gritted his teeth. Return fire. His fleet retaliated, beams of energy lancing through the void, finding targets, striking true. But it did not matter. The human ships did not fight like ships. They fought like beasts. Engines burned at impossible speeds, entire vessels twisting in suicide maneuvers, colliding with Dominion warships and detonating on impact. Human boarding crafts didn't wait for shields to fail. They plowed through them, ripping into hulls with brutal force, disgorging warriors in sealed exosuits that fought with terrifying efficiency. Reports flooded in. Primary reactors failing. We've lost the middeck. Sir, oh gods, they are in the vents. Voss clenched his fists. Full retreat. Now. They had to escape. But the humans had already planned for that, too. The wreckage that had concealed them was not just cover. It was a weapon. Mines, detonating as ships tried to pull away. Debris fields, rigged to collapse inward, crushing vessels in their desperate attempts to flee. This wasn't war. This was butchery. Voss's fleet was disintegrating. His people, his warriors, dying like cattle. He staggered as the Elthery blade trembled under impact, half the viewport flashing with fire and carnage. The Dominion did not understand war. They had spent millennia believing they had transcended it, that they had mastered it, but they had only ever known controlled, structured conflict. Humanity did not fight for control. They fought to kill. And the galaxy had never seen anything like them. A new alert flashed on the console. A transmission. Voss inhaled sharply. He accepted. The screen flickered. A man stared back at him. Scarred. Calm. Cold. Rail Voss, the man said, his voice steady. A Dominion officer would have gloated. A commander would have demanded surrender. But this man, Elias Cross, did neither. Instead, he spoke 3 words. You should have listened. Then the signal cut, and the Dominion fleet burned. The wreckage of the Dominion fleet drifted in silence, the once mighty armada reduced to smoldering debris fields. Voss lay on the floor of his shattered bridge, his breathing ragged, the acrid scent of burning metal thick in the air. His crew, what remained of them, moaned in pain around him, the few survivors struggling to pull themselves from the ruin of what had once been the pride of the Elthery Navy. The humans had not just won. They had annihilated. His hands trembled as he pulled himself up, his body aching from the violent impact of the last blast. The Elthery blade was no longer a warship. It was a tomb, floating aimlessly in the void, powerless, its engines crippled, its shields a distant memory. The Dominion fleet was gone. Hundreds of thousands of warriors, erased in mere moments. His mind struggled to comprehend it. It wasn't supposed to be possible. A flicker of movement on the cracked viewport caught his eye. The human fleet remained, hovering like predatory beasts, watching. They were not celebrating. They were not broadcasting demands. They simply waited. It was not the Dominion way. When a battle was won, there was ceremony, an offer of surrender, a formal resolution. Humanity had no need for such things. A sharp beep on the shattered console made him flinch. Another transmission. He swallowed hard and accepted the link. Elias Cross appeared again, his face as unreadable as before, his dark eyes holding none of the contempt or arrogance Voss expected from a victorious commander. You survived, Cross said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a fact stated with the same neutrality as one might announce the weather. Voss's throat felt dry. This isn't war, he rasped. This is slaughter. Cross did not react. He merely studied Voss, then leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged. Your kind thought war was a game, a tool for control, a means to an end. His voice was level, without mockery, without cruelty. We don't play games, Commander. We finish them. Voss felt his fingers curl into fists, anger clawing through his fear. The Dominion has ruled for millennia. You think one victory changes that? Cross exhaled, slow, patient. "This isn't a victory," he said. "This is the beginning." The words sent a chill through Voss's spine. He had expected defiance. He had expected gloating. He had not expected this calm certainty, this unshakable finality. Cross leaned back slightly, his fingers interlocked. "We gave you chances," he continued. "We tried to negotiate. You sent fleets. We tried to warn you. You ignored us." A pause. "Now, you learn." Voss's heart pounded. "You'll never break the Dominion," he spat, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's bigger than you, stronger than you. It spans entire systems. Even if you wipe out this fleet, another will take its place." Cross tilted his head slightly, considering. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe the others will see this and realize what's coming. Maybe they'll choose survival over pride." His gaze darkened. "But if they don't, we'll burn every last one of them. Until there's nothing left." Voss shook his head, unable to accept it. This wasn't how things worked. The Dominion wasn't meant to fall. Humanity wasn't supposed to be the great threat. They were young. They were reckless. They didn't have the power to stand against an empire. And yet, "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, forcing as much authority into his tone as he could. "If you keep going, the Dominion will retaliate. It won't be just one fleet next time. They will throw everything at you." Cross's lips twitched, the closest thing to amusement he had shown. "You still think this is about battles, about fleets, about numbers?" His eyes sharpened, and for the first time, there was something in them, something cold. "You don't get it, do you?" Voss said nothing. Cross exhaled, and when he spoke again, it was slow, deliberate. "We don't fight like you. We don't think like you. You build ships to patrol, to maintain order, to enforce your version of peace. We build weapons. We don't fight for control. We fight to survive. And when a species fights for survival, it does whatever it takes. No rules. No limits." Voss felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had seen it firsthand, their willingness to sacrifice, to burn their own ships, to erase entire battlefields rather than allow their enemies an inch of ground. This wasn't a people seeking conquest. This was a people ensuring that no one would ever threaten them again. He clenched his teeth. "And what happens when the Dominion surrenders?" he asked. "Will you destroy us anyway? Is this about revenge?" Cross's expression didn't change. "No," he said simply. "This is about making sure no one ever tries this again." Voss wanted to argue, wanted to believe that there was still some way to turn this tide, to force humanity back into the place they belonged. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Dominion had already lost. They just didn't realize it yet. Another sharp beep echoed in the ruined bridge. More signals. More human ships arriving. Cross straightened. "Your escape pods are functional," he said. "Use them. Tell the others what you saw." His eyes hardened. "Tell them to surrender, or tell them to prepare for hell." The transmission cut. Voss stared at the empty screen, his breath shallow, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar coil in his gut. Fear, because he finally understood. The Dominion had ruled for millennia not because they were invincible, but because they had never met an enemy that refused to play by their rules. And now they had. The escape pod's interior was suffocating, the silence pressing down on Rail Voss as he drifted among the wreckage of what had once been the mightiest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled. Fires still flickered in the distance, the remnants of shattered warships now nothing more than lifeless husks spinning through the void. The human fleet did not pursue. They didn't need to. The message had been sent. The war was no longer a question of victory or defeat. It was a warning, a line carved into the galaxy with blood and fire. The transmission looped on the pod's emergency console. Dominion distress channels overrun with frantic voices. Outposts falling silent. Reinforcements vanishing without a trace. Strategic points that should have been impenetrable crumbling overnight. Humanity wasn't fighting for ground. They weren't claiming territory. They were dismantling the Dominion's ability to fight. One system at a time, they erased everything that made the Empire function. The precision of their strikes was surgical. Starports reduced to debris fields before troops could even mobilize. Supply chains severed so completely that entire fleets were left adrift, starving. The Dominion was not fighting an enemy. It was bleeding out, piece by piece, and the humans were standing over them, watching. Voss's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The humans should have been stretched thin, overwhelmed by sheer scale. But their fleets never engaged in prolonged conflict. They attacked, destroyed, and vanished before the Dominion could respond. Their technology wasn't superior. Their numbers weren't overwhelming. But their tactics, their relentless, merciless approach, made them unstoppable. The Dominion had planned for war. Humanity had planned for extinction. The escape pod jolted as it was pulled into the tractor field of a Dominion battleship, one of the few that had managed to retreat intact. The moment the hatch opened, armored hands dragged Voss out, medics scanning him for injuries, officers bombarding him with questions. He had no answers, not the ones they wanted. Admiral Vekris stood on the bridge, his pale, elthery features grim as he studied the tactical display. The war should have been a formality. Instead, it had become a slaughter. The Dominion's forces were collapsing faster than their leaders could comprehend. The High Council had demanded an explanation, had demanded a plan. Vekris had nothing to give them. He turned when he saw Voss approach, his expression unreadable. "You saw them up close," he said. "Tell me, what are we dealing with?" Voss exhaled, steadying himself. "The war is over," he said. The words felt foreign, but they were the only truth left. Murmurs swept through the bridge. Vekris's gaze hardened. "Then we fight to the last." "No," Voss said, his voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs. "You don't understand. They are not looking for a war. They are making sure there isn't one." Vekris narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Voss stepped forward, gesturing to the fading remnants of Dominion-controlled space. "They are not taking territory. They are not holding planets. They are burning everything that could be used against them. They hit our supply lines, not our armies. They cripple our infrastructure, not our leadership. They are not fighting us, Admiral. They are dismantling us." He took a breath. "And we gave them every reason to." Vekris was silent, his fingers tightening behind his back. The reality was undeniable. The Dominion was not fighting an empire looking to conquer. They were fighting a species making sure no one would ever have the ability to threaten them again. A sharp transmission cut through the bridge chatter. An incoming message. Not from a Dominion relay. A human signal. The bridge fell silent as the Dominion officers hesitated. No enemy had ever contacted them directly like this before. No negotiations had been offered. No demands. Just annihilation. "Play it," Vekris ordered. The screen flickered, and there he was, Elias Cross. His expression was calm, unreadable. "To the Dominion leadership," he began, his voice steady, deliberate. "We are done with warnings." Voss felt the tension coil in his gut. Cross continued, "We are not here to bargain. We are not here to negotiate. We tried that before, and you answered with war." His gaze was unwavering. "You assumed you could contain us. You assumed we would fight by your rules." He leaned forward slightly. "You assumed wrong." The bridge remained deathly silent. Cross's tone did not change. "Your empire has ruled through intimidation, through control. You have decided which species rise, which fall. You have played with civilizations as if they were pieces on a board." A pause. "That ends now." A Dominion officer scoffed under his breath. "Empty threats." Cross's eyes flickered slightly, as if he had heard. "You think this is about power." His voice darkened. "It's not. It never was. We didn't start this war. But we will finish it." The image shifted, the transmission cutting to footage of Dominion-controlled worlds. Then the strikes began. Real-time destruction. Entire shipyards, gone in blinding fire. Supply stations crumbling into silence, strategic strongholds blinking out of existence in an instant, not through prolonged sieges, not through occupation, just erasure. One by one, system after system, the Dominion was disappearing. And the humans were doing it effortlessly. The camera cut back to Cross. "There is one path left," he said. "Total surrender. Complete. Unconditional. You will dismantle your war machine. You will disband your ruling council. You will step down from power, and you will never rebuild it." His voice did not waver. "Or you will burn." Silence. Vecrus clenched his jaw. "And if we refuse?" Cross exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Then there will be no survivors." The transmission ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Voss turned to Vecrus. He saw the flicker of hesitation in the Admiral's usually unshakable stance. He saw what he had feared. Vecrus still thought they could win. And that meant they were already dead. The bridge was silent. The weight of the human message still lingered, pressing down on every officer, every crew member. The Dominion had never faced an ultimatum before, never been given a choice where survival was not guaranteed. Vecrus's jaw clenched as he processed the transmission, his mind calculating, searching for a path that did not lead to destruction. His pride warred with reality, but reality was winning. The Dominion was losing, faster than anyone could comprehend. Voss stood rigid, watching, waiting. He knew the Admiral was drowning in his own thoughts, looking for a way to frame this in terms the Dominion could accept. But there was no clever maneuver, no grand counterstroke. There was only survival or annihilation. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "We have to surrender," Voss said finally, his voice breaking through the tension like a knife through glass. Several officers turned sharply toward him, their expressions flickering between disbelief and outrage. Surrender? The very word was foreign to them. The Dominion did not surrender. It had ruled for millennia. It was the apex, the guiding force of order in the galaxy. To surrender was unthinkable. Vecrus's gaze darkened. "We do not bow to primitives." Voss exhaled sharply, the frustration rising in his chest. "Then we burn," he snapped. "Look at the data. They aren't fighting us for conquest. They don't care about holding ground, about governing worlds. They are burning everything that gives us the ability to fight back. This isn't war, Admiral. This is extermination." One of the tactical officers scoffed. "They don't have the strength to wipe us out. Even if they cripple our fleets, we have planets, we have industry, we have the ability to rebuild." Voss's head snapped toward the officer, eyes blazing. "Have you been paying attention? They aren't just destroying ships. They are collapsing infrastructure. They've cut off our food supplies. Our shipyards are rubble. Our communication relays are vanishing overnight. This isn't a battle of attrition. They are ensuring we can never rebuild." His voice lowered, sharp with finality. "And they are holding back." That sent a ripple through the room. Vecrus's expression didn't change, but his silence was telling. He had seen the same reports. The humans were efficient, methodical, terrifyingly precise. They struck where it mattered most, never overextending, never wasting resources. They were culling, not conquering. And yet, if they had the power to dismantle the Dominion so swiftly, why had they not finished it? Why was humanity still offering a choice? Voss knew the answer. The humans weren't interested in dragging this out. They weren't savoring the fight. They were offering an escape, one chance, one opportunity to end it before they committed fully to something even worse. If the Dominion refused, there would be no controlled strikes, no dismantling of infrastructure. There would be only absolute annihilation. Vecrus turned back toward the display, watching as entire systems flickered red, lost to the humans' silent war. His fingers curled into a fist. The realization was settling in, but his pride still held firm. "The High Council will never accept surrender," he said, voice low. Voss's stomach turned. The High Council, the ruling body of the Dominion, ancient, unchallenged, arrogant beyond measure. They had sat in their pristine chambers, watching from afar as their fleets were swallowed by the abyss. They did not understand. They still believed themselves gods among lesser creatures. They would fight to the last system, the last ship, the last soldier. And they would take the entire Dominion with them. Voss stepped forward. Then we don't ask them. That turned heads. Vecris's eyes flicked toward him, assessing, cautious. Voss could feel the weight of every officer's stare, the unspoken challenge in the air. The Dominion had never defied its own leadership. Orders came from above, and they were followed without question. But this was different. This was not a battle against insurgents, not a campaign for expansion. This was survival. Voss met Vecris's gaze and spoke with quiet conviction. We don't have time for politics. We don't have time for the High Council to debate philosophy while our fleets are turned to dust. If we wait for them, we die. His voice sharpened. We can surrender now and live, or we can obey and die as loyal corpses. Another silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. Vecris's jaw tightened. His thoughts were a battlefield of duty and self-preservation. He had spent his entire life following orders, believing in the Dominion's eternal rule. But eternity was an illusion, and even gods could fall. He had seen too much, lost too much. And in the end, he wanted to live. He turned to the communications officer. Prepare a direct transmission to the humans. The officer hesitated. Admiral, if the High Council... I will deal with the High Council. Vecris cut him off. Send the message. The officer swallowed hard and obeyed. The bridge remained still, tense, as the signal was transmitted. No one spoke. No one breathed. They waited. A response came almost immediately. The screen flickered. Elias Cross appeared once more, his expression unreadable. You've made a decision. Vecris straightened. He was not accustomed to speaking from a position of weakness, but weakness was all they had left. We accept your terms. Cross studied him for a long moment, silent, unmoving. Then he nodded. Transmit your fleet's full deactivation protocols. Your command centers will be occupied by human forces. Any resistance will be met with immediate destruction. His voice remained even, merciless. You have until the next rotation cycle to comply. After that, we will assume refusal. Vecris's lips pressed into a thin line. He exhaled, slow and deliberate. Understood. The screen cut to black. A collective breath was released across the bridge. It was done. The Dominion, after millennia of rule, had fallen not to another empire, not to a great galactic power, but to a species they had dismissed as insignificant. The war was over, not through treaty, not through compromise, but through sheer, unrelenting fear. Voss let the reality settle in. They had survived. But survival came with a price. The Dominion was no longer the Dominion. It was a shadow, a remnant of what had once been an unchallenged force. And the humans, they were no longer an unknown variable. They were the new law of the galaxy. He turned toward the viewport, watching as the human fleet loomed in the distance. They had won not because of superior numbers or technology, but because they had refused to break. They had fought without hesitation, without restraint. And now their enemies lay in ruins. The lesson was clear. No one would ever threaten humanity again, not because they were feared, but because there was nothing left to challenge them. The surrender order rippled through the remnants of the Dominion like a shockwave. Some officers obeyed immediately, their survival instincts overriding their loyalty. Others hesitated, their pride battling the reality that had already crushed them. And then there were those who outright refused, who saw surrender as a fate worse than death, who would rather ignite their own warships than see them turned over to human control. But it did not matter. The Dominion's choice had been made. The war was over. Voss stood beside Vecris, watching as the final transmission was relayed across all channels. Dominion forces across the galaxy were receiving the order to stand down, deactivate weapons, and prepare for human oversight. It was surreal. For centuries, the The Dominion had been the one dictating terms, forcing others to kneel before them. Now, they were the ones bowing. The very thought left a bitter taste in his mouth, but it was better than extinction. A low murmur spread through the bridge as reports trickled in. Some Dominion strongholds had cut off communications entirely, going dark rather than responding. Others had activated self-destruction sequences. Their commanders preferred erasing themselves from history rather than living under the rule of those they once deemed beneath them. Voss clenched his fists. Even in defeat, arrogance still poisoned them. But this was the cost of their failure. They had assumed humanity was just another species to be absorbed, another civilization to be shaped by Dominion control. They had been wrong. And now, they had no future. A new signal cut through the noise. A priority message from the human fleet. The bridge fell silent as it was patched through. Elias Cross appeared once more, his face as composed as ever. "The Dominion's surrender has been acknowledged," he said. "Your compliance will be monitored closely. Any deviation from the agreed terms will result in immediate retaliation." His eyes moved to Vekris, then to Voss. "You will oversee the transition. Effective immediately, your fleet is to disarm and report to designated stations for human command review. Civilian networks will remain untouched, but all military infrastructure is now under our control." Vekris's expression was grim, but he nodded. "Understood." Cross studied him for a moment. Then his gaze shifted back to Voss. "I remember you," he said. "You were there. You saw what happened at Draska 7. Voss held his breath. "I did." A pause. Then Cross spoke again. "You're one of the few who understood the truth early. That's why you're still alive." Voss didn't respond. He wasn't sure if it was meant as an insult or an acknowledgement. Maybe both. Cross exhaled. "You'll be given access to the transition protocols. Your people will follow them. If they don't, we won't ask twice." His voice remained calm, controlled. "This war is finished. We intend to make sure it stays that way." The transmission cut. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Then the wout began. One by one, Dominion warships powered down their weapons. Fleet commanders reluctantly followed the disarmament orders, deactivating shields, relinquishing control of their strategic outposts. The once mighty military structure that had ruled the stars for millennia was dismantling itself piece by piece. Voss monitored the reports, watching as once loyal admirals and generals swallowed their pride, handing over the keys to their own empire. Vekris sat motionless at the central command console, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw locked. He had been a soldier of the Dominion for his entire life, had served under its banner with absolute faith. And now he was witnessing its death. He glanced at Voss. "Do you think they'll keep their word?" Voss exhaled slowly. "They don't have to." Vekris frowned. Voss turned to face him fully. "They aren't ruling us, Admiral. They aren't taking control of the Dominion systems because they want them. They are doing it because they have to. If they let us remain as we were, another war would come. Maybe not now, maybe not in our lifetimes, but eventually. And they are making sure that never happens." Vekris's eyes darkened. "You think they are wiping us out in everything but name?" Voss nodded. "They don't need to conquer us. They just need to ensure we're never a threat again." Vekris looked away. He knew Voss was right. The High Council had always operated under the belief that the Dominion's rule was eternal, that its power was self-sustaining. That belief had been shattered. The humans had exposed the Empire for what it truly was: fragile. They had cut out its foundation, torn away the illusions, and left it crumbling under its own weight. The hours stretched on as Dominion warships were escorted to designated stations. Human oversight teams boarded strategic command hubs, taking control without resistance. The transition was swift, efficient, absolute. There were no executions, no public humiliations. Just a silent shift of power from one ruler to another. The Dominion's era had ended without ceremony. Voss eventually stepped away from the bridge, needing a moment away from the weight of it all. He moved through the corridors of the ship, the familiar halls now feeling foreign. The Elthery blade had once been a symbol of strength. Now, it was just another relic of a broken empire. He stopped at a viewport, staring out into the void. The human fleet remained in formation, their presence unwavering. Even in victory, they did not waver. He had seen many enemies of the Dominion. He had fought species that had tried to resist, civilizations that had dared to challenge their rule. None had lasted. But humanity had never wanted to rule. They had only wanted to ensure that no one could ever rule them. And they had succeeded. A quiet voice broke his thoughts. "Do you think we deserve this?" Voss turned. One of the junior officers stood there, her expression troubled. She was young, barely past her first command rotation, her uniform still crisp despite the chaos of the war. He studied her for a moment before answering. "We earned this," he said. "We assumed we were invincible. We assumed we had control. And when we lost it, we thought we could force things back into place." His voice lowered. "But there was never a place for us to return to. The Dominion was always living on borrowed time. The humans just made sure the debt was paid." The officer swallowed hard. "What happens to us now?" Voss looked back at the human fleet. The answer was simple. "We survive."